Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that always keeps a professional veneer.
Well, actually, I think you'll find
Oh.
it's impossible to get a word in with this clown.
So we'll move straight on into our headlines tonight. And our first one from the Metro, a world-beating fiasco. 48,000 contacts are lost without a trace. What happened there, Rob?
So yeah, this is the story that the UK is sort of starting to see its second wave of COVID come through. I think that's fair to say, as we've seen a steady rising number of cases. Last time we were talking, the test and trace system was under stress. Matt Hancock and Boris Johnson were facing questions from Keir Starmer, basically saying that people had to drive very long distances to try and get a test, and there were worries that there weren't enough tests available. Now we've started to see more positive results come through, and that was starting to worry people and worry what the results of that might be. However, there was a slight dip, and everybody thought, "Oh, we might be over this."
I was going to say, I'm using one of these apps, which is part of a study where you self-report so that they can try and, if you then get infected, they'll get an idea of what kind of symptoms you had in the lead up to it, and it kind of gives you a summary of what's happening in the UK this week at the top of the app when you open it. And they were like, yeah, trending downwards, looks like things are getting under control. And it was like, oh, well, that's good. We had these extra restrictions come in and they seem to be working. Seems like we can get through this, because if you can kind of put measures in, take them off, put them on, until we have a vaccine, that seems like a reasonable way to go about life, with some annoyances, but it's not going to be the end of the world.
So that was the theory behind it anyway. But then it was later discovered that 48,000 contacts had actually been lost or not reported correctly. And even maybe more disturbingly, the fact that this data was stored in an Excel spreadsheet.
Not even just an Excel spreadsheet, not a .xlsx file, as most people will be used to these days, but in a .xls file, which is a format that has been defunct since 2007. Well, we can go into the technicalities here. It sounded bad, and then it got worse when I read the story.
If you know more about the technicalities than I do, go ahead. Then what? Because all I understand about the test and trace system, and as the Metro headline suggests, a world-beating fiasco is their sort of subheading to the the 48,000. We've been told from the start that this will be a world-beating track and trace system, and every failure that seems to happen with it seems to reinforce the message that it really isn't. I've gone so far as just to download the official NHS app on my phone, but do you know more about the technical side of that and how all the data is being stored in the background?
Well, so I think there's several things going on. The phone app works on an API that's been developed by Apple and Google, because the original thing when the government we're going to do our own app was that the problem with that is that means the government literally has access to your data. Do you trust the government with that data about where you've been all the time? I think most people would tend towards no, especially after various things that have happened this summer. People are like, we don't want the government knowing that much about me. And that's had a knock-on effect. Even now it's using this API that's been developed by Google and Apple. But basically, the way it works, and it's actually quite interesting, I noticed on my phone, you can go into the features, you can turn off the core feature that's underneath the app, and obviously the app would stop working, but you can go in and you can see all the times it's logged you being near someone for 15 minutes, within 2 meters. So it'll be did a log, and you can't get any other information other than the log happened at that time. And what they do is they save a unique ID, which can be traced back to the other person, but knows no other information about them. This means these two devices were within 2 meters of each other for 15 minutes, and they know the time that it happened. But that's not that doesn't have a GPS location. It's based on your Bluetooth. But that's the app is a side issue to this thing here. I mean, I think the way the app is currently set up, I think everyone should download it and use it. And I think the problem is that some people are not trusting it because of the earlier attempts. But I've seen it being fine. The only thing that's a bit weird about that app is that it tells you, it has a notification which is you may have been near someone who, but basically someone has gone for a test or something, and it's it knows, and this is built in part of the Apple iOS a built-in part of the Google/Apple functionality where it pings you this notification. If you click on it, it takes you to the app and there's no more information. And a lot of people were confused over that because they were like, oh, if I got COVID, do I have to self-isolate? And you only have to self-isolate if you get the specific notification that tells you that. So there's two types of notification. And I think the first time you get it, it goes, oh, warning, COVID app. And you're like, oh, wow, I'm going to have to stay at home for 14 days. So I think that's an important thing to be aware of. But the technical thing about this, which is interesting. So the issue with the track and trace is you have to store a lot of information for... and more information is coming in, and especially as you start to have a spike, that information, the sheer amount of information you have to store on the people you're tracking and tracing, because you're going to have to at least have their name, their address, the places they were. That's a fair amount of information to store. So I'm not saying it's the easiest problem in the world, but there are a lot of people who deal with databases of information that could be employed to deal with this. And one would assume if you've hired a company to do it, they would have some developers who know what they're doing with this. Seems like that was not the case because they were using an Excel spreadsheet instead of any number of database things that exist out there and are quite easy to set. Like that, you can normally get a basic working one done in a few hours if you've never done it before by following a guide online, as long as you have some computer coding experience. Getting it to do everything you want, sure, might take a little bit longer, but given how long they've had to implement this, I don't think it's unreasonable to say that you could employ one or two decent developers and they would have done it by now. Yeah, sure, there'll be bugs, but that's software. So instead of doing that, they used an Excel spreadsheet, which is already a bad idea. But then they used a really old version of Excel, which is like the compatibility mode that can still be opened in before we had this cloud version of Office 365. And so that's the .xls format as opposed to the .xlsx format. And because it's an older format, it has more limitations. And because of Microsoft's backwards compatibility and all of that, you can't change limits on a thing like that because it has to be openable in the old software. And so there's a limit of the number of rows and the number of columns. And it sounds like, and this is the most bizarre bit to me, how do you store stuff in a table? If you're making a table, how do you store that information? Like just as a general question, if you were making a table, where would you put the headings and where would you put the data?
I'll put the headings at the top and the data down the side, I guess.
Exactly. That's the normal way of doing it. That's how Excel is designed. So Excel's limit of rows is a big number. It's like, I think it's like 160,000 or something. It's probably the maximum number you can store in 2 to the 32 or something like that, which is a standard limit of old software because that's how binary works. 32-bit numbers. Well, I'm not going to get into that. It's accidentally become a tech podcast. But yeah, like you have that information. So yeah, rows, you can have a lot of rows. Columns, however, you can't have as many columns because people tend to use columns less. So when they were working out how much data they're going to store, they chose to have more rows than columns. A reasonable decision by Microsoft because reasonable people put headings at the top and put their data downwards. Now, for whatever reason, the people who designed this system did it the other way around. So the reason they actually ran out of space is because they only had like 16,000 per spreadsheet. And on one day when they got more than like 16,540 something, once you get more than that many columns, all that other data was lost. And they didn't get like a message back saying, oh, there's an issue with the data. So they must have been doing something automated to put it into a spreadsheet. But yeah, that's what went wrong, basically. And I very rarely, I know we can be critical of the government for things they do that, but we can understand there's a lot of pressures on the government to do things, etc., and on these companies. But there are very few situations where I feel like I could have done a better job, especially if you paid me 35 million, which I believe was the contract for this specific bit. A lot of people are talking about 12 billion, which I think is the total Serco contract to cover a whole lot of bits of this track and trace app. But I believe, and I may be wrong, but from what I've seen, it was 35 million to cover this particular bit. If you'd paid me 35 million 6 months ago, I bet you I'd have got this done. And a lot of my friends who know how to program would be much richer now because I'd have just paid them like 2 million each for their time, and we'd be done. It's very rare, I feel, to be in a situation where I feel I can very clearly criticize and be like, I could have done this better myself. And this is one of those examples where it's like, oh, that's not hard. I know a lot of people who are young and in software, and Serco could have just hired 3 of them, especially during the pandemic when you want to be offering jobs to people who might have lost their job.
Yeah, precisely. That is madder than I first thought. Then just that rows and columns business kind of shows that it appears that they've made the wrong decision at every possible turn there, almost.
Yeah, yeah.
That's wow. Okay.
So yeah, I knew far too much about that particular issue because I've been following it. So I think we have two headlines that go together here. So from the Metro, we have lockdowns are failing. And from the Express, we have it's very tough, but we have to stick with it, which I'm pretty certain is a line from the Day to Day.
It sounds like it, doesn't it? It's a line from Matt Hancock, actually, but I think those two things are interchangeable, really, with how well Matt Hancock's interviews go. So we've been talking about this second spike, and with that second spike comes the possibility of fresh lockdowns. We've already alluded to the fact that, particularly in the north, there are areas and cities that are coming under stricter and stricter sort of legislation to try and tie them down. And the big worry is that we could have another lockdown like we did at the start, and nobody is keen to do that. I think it's fair to say that at the start, when this crisis happened and we all suddenly went into lockdown for those first 6 weeks, it was quite a harsh lockdown, but it's because we'd had zero restrictions before that, and everybody could kind of understand why we had to put a hard stop on it. It was a disease we had very limited understanding of as well, and nobody really knew. There was no track or trace system even set up then, so there's no way you could kind of like control or trace where it had been. It seemed to be out there in the general public. Now we're feeling like, there are different ways that we can put the brake on things. There are different ways we can lock down. We can, we saw the government, for example, saying that pubs can't be open past 10 o'clock. Now that's maybe not the most stringent lockdown measure. COVID doesn't suddenly go away at 10 p.m. or come out at 10 p.m. It's not like a gremlin. But they're like small measures to try and do that. What's worrying now, particularly, is that criticism is starting to come from various corners within Parliament. So that Metro headline has a picture of Keir Starmer because Keir Starmer brought up the data in the House of Commons that said, look, these areas that are under lockdown had an R rate of this when the lockdown was put in place. And 2 weeks later, look, it's actually gone up more. The lockdown doesn't seem to be doing anything. So why are we putting people under these restrictions if it's actually damaging to the economy and not having the effect that we wish it's having? On the other side of the House, you've got backbench Conservatives who are growing in their frustration of the government's ability to handle this crisis, and I think they're attacking it from generally like a more libertarian angle of, oh my goodness, isn't the government doing a lot to, refrain people, put limits on people's social liberties? We're uncomfortable with this, and we know that our constituents are starting to get a little bit angsty about it. And importantly for the Conservatives, places which are spiking at the moment tend to be in the north of England, and they are those traditional red wall seats, the ones that fell from Labour and into the hands of the Conservatives in the 2019 election. The Conservatives clearly feel that it's vital that they keep those seats on side if they want to maintain big majorities in the future. Because if they lose them now, then it's very possible that those seats will turn to Labour again for another generation. If they've only just turned Conservative, you want to try and keep them on side. So the fact that they're failing to do so is a big worry for them. So that's why that first headline came from. That second one from Matt Hancock, it's very tough, but we have to stick with it, kind of sums up the position of the cabinet and Boris Johnson. They're just saying we've got to get our head down and get through this. But I think time will tell how long how long Parliament will stay on side. They were meant to have a vote in the House of Commons on the next round of COVID restrictions, and that was pushed back to Monday. The thought was there that it gives the government a bit more time to get the whips they need to try and drum up the Conservative support to get that bill through Parliament. Now it looks like Labour won't support it because Keir Starmer led with it in PMQs. You might have expected Keir Starmer to stand with Boris Johnson on this fact, because I think Keir Starmer has always said, look, we'll support lockdowns and we'll support the government when there is evidence and the science backs that up. So I think it was quite telling on Wednesday when Keir Starmer specifically brought up those facts and just said, look, lockdowns, in our opinion, are failing. This is why we can't really support this bill. And in general, the fact that COVID restrictions haven't really been voted on in the past is a new thing. And I just wanted to touch on it very quickly that I can't remember if I did it last time, but did you hear about the fuss the speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, made about a week ago about the way the government had treated COVID restrictions and sort of the big tongue lashing he gave the government?
I don't think I heard. Let me start again. I don't think I heard any particular quotes, but I got the general gist of it.
Yeah. It was kind of, I think there is even a meme of a Conservative MP going around saying, does nobody have any respect for this house? If I can find that. It's funnier than I make out. Sorry, anyway. Lindsay Hoyle, the speaker last week, did come out and say, look, we've been quite lenient with the government and the way that you put this legislation in place because we understand that it's emergency. But now these things should really be debated in Parliament, or at least put before the House of Commons before they are made public knowledge. Matt Hancock's restrictions can't be announced to the public first and then the House later, was their point, was because the House has to debate on it and say if this is the right thing. Now you can debate if in the case of emergency, the government should have powers to shut things down completely. I don't remember the lockdown for 6 weeks being voted on. We were told it was happening and everybody went, okay, this is tough, but now we've got to do it. But now COVID is more of a normal thing and something we have to live with, and those restrictions we feel, might need some, how effective those lockdowns are now coming into question.
They need oversight.
They need oversight, and MPs feel that they need some form of debate rather than just bowing to the government's every wish every time they wish to lock down a bit of the country. So it'll just be one other thing to look out for in Parliament. We've said that backbench rebellions and U-turns are kind of what this government has been living with since March. It'll be really interesting to see if that is another U-turn the government's forced into, or if they don't lock down places in the country as hard as possible, because they fear, one, the evidence doesn't back it up, and two, they fear it's ultimately a vote loser. Not that there's election anytime soon, but they really don't want to lose the faith of the supporters they recently were able to get the vote of just 8 months ago.
Yeah, I'm not sure I really have much to add to that other than to clarify that there is indeed a quote from the day-to-day when Peter O'Hanrahan goes to Germany and fails to interview the finance minister, and so makes up the quote, he didn't like the deal, but he had to go along with it. Which is it's very close. I was right. So, life imitating art. I think it's time to move on to our main story tonight. Sticking with the political theme, we're going to touch on the debates in the US general election. So I think we have two debates to cover, don't we? We have both the presidential candidate debate, so Trump versus Biden, and then also there was the vice presidential debate, which was Kamala Harris versus Mike Pence.
Yeah, so let's start with the first one, the more important one, people would see, between President Trump and his adversary, Joe Biden. Looking back, the history of presidential debates goes back to the first one, first televised debate between Kennedy and Nixon, and they've always been built up in the public psyche as, two political heavyweights, two titans going at it, and it's kind of like, if you want to know what American democracy is, you look at those debates, two people at the height of their profession battling it out in a chess game, a big battle of wits. Unfortunately, this one that was sort of like, this debate was one that was marred by interruptions and kind of a sense of this is where American democracy is now. And I was unable to watch the debates in their entirety. They are on at like 2:00 in the morning UK time, which is something that I, won't stay up for. And if I have to watch it for 2 hours, then it's going to be like quite a big drain. And from the sounds of it, that first debate was a really big drain for anybody who watched it, because it was car crash television. People, you have to watch because it's the debates. You can't look away. But the quality of debate wasn't there. There was several interruptions. I don't have the stats for how much Biden interrupted Trump, but apparently Trump interrupted Biden 73 times, which is an awful lot. And it kind of was, it was marred by the moderator kind of failing to take control of the situation. I think even at one point he turned to Trump and said, look, when you agreed to this, you said that Biden would get 2 minutes without an interruption. You're not abiding by those rules. They're rules that your own team agreed to, so why don't you do that?
But then he didn't really follow up on it. Like he said, I know he said that, but like it didn't come through over the rest of it.
Yes, because I mean, I guess for Trump, he feels that, hey, there are no consequences. If there's a point I want to make, I'm going to say it. That's the Trumpian style. And I think this debate kind of showed that this is where Trump has an ability to pull his opponents down to his level, or that's what he's always trying to do. These debates always remind me of the refrain of, like, when you're trying to have a debate online, it's like playing chess with a pigeon. It'll knock the pieces over, shit on the board, and say that it's won anyway, and that is kind of Trump's approach to debates, I feel.
I think we could have predicted the interruptions from him against Hillary. Like, I remember, there's the often used quote, when they go low, we go high, right? So that's kind of what Hillary tried to do. Hillary tried to have a reasonable conversation with him, and he spoke over her. People were very annoyed, especially, it's bad anyway, but doubled with the fact that she was a woman candidate, and that is a problem in workplaces all across the world where women are generally talked over. So it was like doubly bad from that point of view. But to the people who were voting Trump, they were like, oh, well, he was out there, he was bullish, he was everything we wanted him to be. So that didn't end up helping Hillary at all, really. So I don't think the interruptions are surprising. I think what I was probably surprised about was like how Biden reacted in response to that, which, as you say, being brought down to his level, was you kind of thought that's not what Biden's going to do. But in some ways, him being combative, I think, was probably important, because otherwise he would have got completely walked over.
Yeah, the big quote that stood out is like the "Will you shut up, man?" And there was another one where he says, "I can't do anything with this clown," and then corrects himself and says, "Sorry, person." Those are the two moments where the professional mask kind of slipped from Biden a little. But I also feel that "Will you shut up, man?" bit was kind of, it resonated. It kind of said what everybody was thinking in their head. So I don't think that was a disastrous moment for Joe. And particularly when you compare it with everything Trump says, Biden's kind of allowed one or two of those. If Biden's main aim of this debate was to come out looking more presidential than Trump, I think he achieved that aim, even though he wasn't 100% focused. Even though he wasn't 100% professional, I think Biden's main challenge coming into that debate, if I was to say, how people were framing it, was that Biden was seen before that debate as a doddery old man who might trip over his words and get lost in the middle of sentences. And Trump's interruption tactic might have been something that he's trying to throw Joe Biden off guard. So, by constantly interrupting, by trying to get under his skin, he might be trying to force Biden into a mistake. I don't think he was. I think he was able to control himself very well, given everything that was going on. So, yeah, that was the general tone of the debate, and those two quotes thrown in. But I feel on the subject of interruptions, it was certainly Trump causing more chaos than Biden.
Yeah. No, I definitely got that impression, but the main takeaway was this was not like a civil debate from all corners as well. So I think, I definitely feel like it was something that's not necessarily as much of a negative for Biden as you might think from the descriptions we've heard, but yeah, I think it was just kind of a bit of a shame when you're kind of like, oh, maybe we'll have an interesting debate, and it seems like it was a bit of a shambles. So do you want to dive deeper into the topics covered in the debate? There was we listed them last time, actually. There was quite a range of topics.
The big thing was COVID, and that's a big thing that kind of has to be talked about. It's dominated the political conversation, as we said, for the last 6-7 months. and it's one that you'd expect Biden to do quite well on and Trump quite poorly on. The fact that, the majority of Americans seem to think that Trump has handled this crisis quite poorly. It was that part of the debate went on for half an hour, dragged on, where you had the most of the interruptions in there. That was the part where you had this odd exchange between the two about who's smart. Biden said he was smart, and then Trump kind of said, look, I graduated top of my class at Harvard, you were a flunky, blah, blah, blah. Don't talk to me about being smart, which kind of took me back because, you would expect from the personas of the two that Biden would be the more qualified. And even if Biden maybe didn't get the best grades at school, I feel that for two 70-year-old plus men, maybe your grades at college don't mean everything now. Maybe your life experience and how you've treated things would have more of a greater influence over the proceedings. So that was just like a little bit. That was, these debates usually, even though they go on for hours, they can be cut down into memorable sound bites or 30-second to a minute moments, and they're the ones that will be discussed. And that was just a little one from that, which I think people would be surprised about, the fact that Trump would choose that line of attack for Joe Biden. And once again, I don't know if it's because, surprise, surprise, I'm not the biggest Trump supporter, but hearing Trump say that he's super smart, there's a real, you struggle to believe him, in a sense. I don't know if you get that, and I don't know if you've seen that clip, but it's kind of like, it shows the man's bravado, his confidence. He clearly thinks that saying, basically sticking his thumb up and saying, no, I'm smarter than you because I've got a piece of paper that says so, is something that's going to persuade voters. And I'm not quite sure that's the tack that you want to take during a presidential debate. But as we've already mentioned, this isn't maybe the most traditional presidential debate. Trump is trying to bring people down to his level. If that is a level that speaks to the American public more, that's what we have to find out. But certainly from political commentators, I don't think it was taken too kindly, that line of attack.
It's certainly a very childish form of attack. It's the kind of thing that, and I think also I don't want to say it's an American style of thing. I think Trump is a certain type of American. He's not indicative of all Americans by a long way, but it's definitely the kind of thing that in the UK would definitely be a negative, where the idea of, one thing we're always kind of expecting to do is kind of diminish our accomplishments. And the idea that you'd walk around saying you're the smartest is, I think, kind of so antithetical to, even with Boris getting up there and saying we're going to have the best track and trace app and things like this, that kind of bravado is not very common in the UK in general. And so it's very weird watching something like that that's both kind of childish and very boastful, I think. And I think that's probably because we're British, it's harder for us to understand who that would appeal to. So another big story that's been in the news and was covered in the debate, Trump has been, there's been talk about mail fraud, mostly from Trump, despite the fact there's very little evidence for it. There's been lots of issues about sorting machines and stuff like that, people not being able to sign up for postal votes and things in the US, and also Trump kind of making it sound like he's not going to hand over power easily. Kind of things a dictator says, if I'm honest. So how did that part of the debate go? Bearing in mind, since then, Trump has essentially said, sorry, I forgot what he said, but he basically made the stocks plummet by saying something stupid as well, didn't he?
Yeah, I think it was based around the fact that he wouldn't... There's been a lot of talk about a peaceful transition of power, and that will Trump respect the results of the election no matter what they are, which, as a presidential candidate, you're kind of expected to say, yes, of course, I respect American democracy. American democracy is great. It's the best in the world, blah, blah, blah. Trump is not traditional in that sense. He's attacked kind of particularly mail fraud. As you pointed out, there's very little evidence at all that there is any form of mail ballot voting, the mail fraud that will go on as a result of the increased number of mail ballots that are happening. Because, of course, because of COVID, people are less likely to go in person to the polls. They'll want to get that voting done early. The fact that Trump said that, he might not accept the result, or that we might not know the result of the election for months afterwards because of the number of mail ballots. And if there are a number of mail ballots, that might cause a challenge in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court might have to be the ones to determine the eventual result, like they did in 2000 between Bush and Gore. The other important thing about that, of course, is that Trump has rushed through his latest Supreme Court pick to replace RBG, which means that, if he's got a court that is 6-3, because it will be 9 judges, if it will be 6-3 in favor of Republicans, that again increases the chances that Trump could win the election essentially like by the back door, by winning it in the courts, rather than winning it on the number of ballots actually, cast in his favor. So there was a lot of debate over that issue, and I think this is where fact checkers had a real field day, kind of dismissing Trump's claims or saying that they are like largely, if not completely untrue. But it's another chance for Trump to get across his message that he doesn't trust mail, and maybe put a little bit of doubt in voters' minds about how they use that, or maybe forcing people to go to the polls rather than casting their mail ballot. Again, it's very I think it's bad form from this president to do it, but I don't think Trump particularly cares. It's a tactic that may win him the election, and he's willing to go down that route. If you want.
So continuing with things where you think it'd be obvious to get a president to come out and stand against it, I think there was a question to ask if they would condemn white supremacy. And given that Trump has had a fair number of white supremacists support him, even if he hasn't technically come out to say that he's for white supremacy, how did that go down?
Yeah, pretty poorly. I think if I had to pick up one part of the night that really stuck around, it was this bit. This was the one that was being discussed days after the event. So the moderator, I think, said to President Trump, basically says, "Do you condemn white supremacists?" And Trump basically said, sure, but there's a lot of people on the left that are also bad," and tried to flip that whole question of law and order back onto, the left are just as bad, if not worse, than white supremacists, and tried to talk about Antifa. The moderator doubled down and said, "No, but you've got to condemn white supremacists." And Trump was like, "Who do you want me to condemn?" The Proud Boys, he mentioned, which is a group I was unaware of until recently, until President Trump mentioned them. But they are essentially quite a small white supremacist group that exist and are very pro-Trump. Trump didn't condemn them, but he said for them to stand by.
Yeah, that's a bit worrying, isn't it? Like they're his own militia.
Yes, and the fact that he did that then became like a rallying cry for them online. Kind of, they felt it was a subtle endorsement by the president of their practices. And the fact that the man it should be the easiest question, shouldn't it? Like, do you condemn white supremacy? Yes. The debate should move on. So maybe the question is like, why does Trump feel that he can't condemn white supremacists? It's because maybe part of his message is that he speaks to that group of people in America. I don't think it's too controversial to say that. Trump has consistently, when he's been asked, particularly when you had the event at Charlottesville, where one protester lost her life due to sort of like a hit and run incident, even then the president was asked to condemn that attack, and his response was, "There are fine people on both sides," which is kind of like shocking in itself. The fact that he's been unable to move away from that line of thought 2 years down the line, and that he seems to give the impression to white supremacists in America that President Trump is on their side, because they are. They're not all of Trump's base, but they are part of Trump's base. Those people are very unlikely to vote Biden, I'm assuming. Maybe that's why he's unwilling to condemn them entirely. Now, I think it is worth pointing out that in the days after the debate, President Trump did try to withdraw those comments and move on from them, and said that he condemned white supremacy. But the fact that he couldn't do it in the moment when put on the spot, that was in a debate. it's all that candidate, right? There's no team around him telling him what he should or shouldn't say. I feel that the statements that came out the day after were the Republicans looking at how much bad press those statements had got, how much of a vote loser it was for moderate Republicans who may be trying to justify still voting for Trump at the next election, that people might be pushed away from that. He was kind of forced to retract that. But the fact in the moment, the fact that his gut reaction wasn't to say, yes, of course I condemn white supremacy, is really worrying. And I think that was the biggest story that came out of those debates. I think if you looked at a 30-second clip and say, oh my goodness, that's really damaging for candidate X, that was the moment, and that was where I thought, in my opinion, where Trump lost the debate, or at least was a potential big vote loser, particularly amongst lots of moderate Republicans.
One thing I just want to throw in there as a bit of levity while we're going through this is that because there is a Proud Boys hashtag that started to be used by people who are presumably Proud Boys, the kickback from that on Twitter has been excellent, with lots and lots of gay men who are in couples, often long-term relationships, posting photos of themselves with just the hashtag Proud Boys to drown out the hate, which has been really nice to see. And also, it's just nice that people can push back against some of this horrible stuff that we see on the news at the moment. The next thing that was discussed was the fact that Trump has paid maybe a lot less tax than you might expect.
So, and in the days running up to the debate, we didn't cover it last time, but it was revealed that President Trump, due to sources close to him and from a New York Times article, had paid $750 tax in the last year, which is stupidly low for a man who claims to be a millionaire, if not a billionaire, and with all the property he has. It just seemed farcical, and many people thought that would understandably play against the president, because you have a lot of ordinary Americans going, well, I earn, I'm in a mid-range salary, or I earn quite a poor salary, and I pay more of that, more than that in taxes per year. Why is the president not paying more? So it was brought up and it was talked about, but essentially I think the response he gave in 2020 was pretty much the same as the one that he gave in 2016, which was, he said the IRS are currently auditing his taxes and they're doing, a very long job on it because it's very complex. When the results are out, he's happy to share them, but not now. Which I think is a cop-out. And again, although there wasn't any knockout blow in the debates, it at least showed that this story does have traction, and I think will continue to have traction, particularly if it comes out later. If that 700, I think some Trump supporters have been able to dismiss that figure of 750 because it came from an unknown source in a New York Times article, and for Trump supporters, they don't feel the New York Times is a reputable source. Now, I think it's fairly, clear to say that probably is the case, even though we can't confirm it with 100% certainty. And the fact you can't confirm it is why Trump is able to have a degree of ambiguity and people can ignore it a little bit. Trump's taxes, like I said, was brought up in 2016. It didn't appear to be a massive vote loser, so maybe he's not that concerned about it. But actually putting a number to it, that $750 figure, I think that's just like a small nugget that will stick in voters' minds when they go to the polls. If you're going to be labeling, if you're going to talk about things that came out of this debate or things that you label Trump with, the fact he didn't condemn white supremacists and he only pays $750 in tax a year, you got to wonder, if the president does pay his taxes, why should I pay my taxes? It could undermine a lot of things in American politics entirely. So, I thought that bit was worth picking up on as a small point and something that you might see run during this election campaign.
Yeah. I'm just going to, I don't have much to add on that, but I would like to point people towards Planet Money by NPR, which is a very good podcast. Anyway, they did an excellent episode on this, talking about something that I think, especially to British listeners, again, is a bit confusing about how the tax system works in the US, because in the UK, everything's kind of automated, and if you do under or overpay tax, it just kind of gets sorted out most of the time. It's very rare that you get a giant check Normally, it's just they slightly change your tax code and your monthly payments change, and by the time the next year's come around, you're square, whichever way it is. Sometimes it's like £500 in your favour, and the government gives you a check, but most of the time, they just sort it out. Whereas in the US, you have to file your own taxes, and things can get interesting. But the key takeaways from that is it seems like the way he writes off a lot of his taxes are to do with losses on his business. So then the questions are twofold. One, are his businesses really losing that much money? Because he seems to live a quite lavish lifestyle for someone who has zero money. And equally, I think it's nearly all of his family get paid consultancy fees, which are therefore tax deductible. So basically, they're getting a salary from the business that then become tax deductible because it's seen as a business expense. But the question is how, I mean, again, we at this point, without all the information, we can only guess and speculate. But it's basically, given that that seems a bit dodgy, how dodgy is it, I suppose, is the question. But 20 minutes of your life that I think would be very interesting if you're into this kind of thing, worth listening to. So I think we're going to move on to our next topic. So if that was kind of the anti-Trump question of all of them, I mean, condemn white supremacy, he may have dealt badly with it, but he should have. You know, saying, yes, I condemn white supremacy is an easy answer. The taxes were kind of focused on him. There was kind of a bit more of a focus in this next question, kind of a bit more anti-Biden, because it was focusing on the military, which I think is something Trump is generally seen as doing quite well on, despite the fact initially when he took office, I know the various military people were concerned. But also that then turned into a comment about Biden's son, Hunter Biden.
Yeah, I feel that this was maybe one of the lower points in the debate in terms of tone, and I thought showed that Trump was willing to do anything to try and score political points from his opponent. So I believe the point with regards to the military was sort of brought up. You know, they were talking about law and order and the military, etc., etc. There have also been reports recently that Trump views like people who lost wars as losers, so doesn't feel that they should be respected. And that was another story that broke from journalists or from generals that were very close to Trump, kind of talking about how he had toured like the cemeteries in Normandy and didn't really get it because he felt that, if they died, then they were a loser, which is kind of like a terrible thing to say about somebody who's meant to have given their life for their country. So Biden hit back with this and started talking about his son, Beau Biden, who had served in Iraq as I don't remember if it's a general, but anyway, he'd served in Iraq and won a medal, and also tragically had passed away from a brain tumor only like the past 5 years. So that's something quite close to heart. So you've got Biden saying, like, you know, basically, I think you should support our troops more. My son Beau was a hero, continues to be a hero. Trump brushes that to the side quite brutally just by saying, I didn't know Beau, but I know Hunter, and Hunter Biden went to the military as well and did loads of drugs and got a dishonorable discharge and then did some bad stuff in the Ukraine, which you helped him with, which is Trump kind of dig up the dirt of all of that. When Trump was impeached, a lot of it was about his quid pro quo that he maybe gave to Ukraine, and during those conversations, Hunter Biden came up as a possible, maybe the Democrats aren't so clean and all this as well. That was Trump trying to distract from his impeachment back then. It appears that Trump isn't letting that go, and he's still willing to bring it up as an attack point. But I think the fact that he kind of dismissed Beau Biden and his memory so quickly, and there was such a turn, there wasn't even I think a more traditional presidential candidate wouldn't have gone for that attack line, or if they did, they would have said, I respect Beau Biden and everything that he did for our country, however I think Hunter is, blah, blah, blah. He didn't even do that. He just kind of pushed Biden's point away. And I felt Biden's response to that felt quite heartfelt. So he was saying that, you know, look, he openly admitted that his son Hunter had a drug problem, and it was something that he'd worked on and got better at, and that's all we can do. And, you know, as many American, I think his exact quote was, many Americans have also had drug problems and are overcoming them. This is something we can all the message there was something this will all go overcome if we have the support of our families. I just felt that was another moment that stood out to me as very poor form from the president, and another moment that might stick in people's minds that this is a man who's willing to, no topic is off limits for this president. He will go for your family, whatever, if it's trying to score political points over you. That was just a bit that made my eyebrows raise and thought, I don't think that's going to play very well when it does the rounds and the news the next day.
It's one of those things where you feel like you could have gone into this with a very reasonable strategy, and Trump has definitely taken it too far. And I'm sure there are members of his base who are like totally on board with that, but it definitely feels like it's crossing a line. It's gone too far.
Yeah, I can't remember. I can't remember who was the vice president at the time, but it was against. There was a vice presidential debate which featured Dick Cheney, and I believe Dick Cheney's daughter is a lesbian. So that was brought up by one of the Democratic candidates about her daughter's sexual orientation and how the Republicans are kind of against that. And yeah, you could see when that was brought up in the debate that really offended Dick Cheney, that his daughter would be used as a political point against him. And it was widely considered at the time that was very poor form from the Democrats to even bring that up. Like, you may know that information about a presidential or a vice presidential candidate's family, but leave the families out of this. This is about, you and the other person and the other political party. You shouldn't be getting personal like that. So I think that's been proven to not be very effective. And yeah, Trump went there again, basically.
So that was that first debate, which, as we say, was a bit of a mess. We've now also had the vice presidential debate, as I mentioned at the top of the episode. So how did that go? I mean, I think my takeaway was it was a bit calmer, and it definitely seemed more like what we would expect from a presidential debate.
Yes, it was. And as a result, it was a bit more boring. And maybe that goes to show that even if we're looking for these civilized debates, when they are more civilized, they get talked about less. I mean, it's very hard to tell from a vice presidential debate because traditionally people don't really care about them, which is terrible because particularly in this case, one of these two people really could be the next president of the United States, depending on, health and age, etc. These are the two oldest presidential candidates we've got going up against each other. So it's more likely than ever that one of these might have to step into the role of president in the next 4 years. But as a result, the main thing that came out of that debate, or at least the thing that was being shared on social media a lot, was a fly landed on Mike Pence's hair and stayed there for about 2 minutes. Now, a fly also landed on Hillary Clinton during one of the debates in 2016, which has led some people to think that it is the same fly and it prophesizes who will lose the election. But the fact that was the main talking point maybe tells you all you need to know about the content of that debate. I mean, I will try and tell you more about the content, but yeah, the fact that was the main talking point and people were going, huh, lol, a fly, maybe tells you a bit more about how dull that debate actually is and how dull proper political discourse really is.
I think it was more sedate, more what we'd expect, as you say, but yeah, possibly that was a bit boring. On the flip side, news that wasn't at all boring was the unsurprising fact that Trump actually contracted COVID, which I think all of us could have seen coming, especially given the fact that he rarely wears a mask. I mean, I think we discussed it as a big point the first time he wore a mask. It's kind of surprising he hasn't caught it before this point. But yeah, how is that going to affect future debates? And also, how many of his staffers now have it? Because it was quite a lot last time I checked.
Yeah, it seems to have ripped through the White House. So one of the patient zeros, or the main name that was coming up when Trump said that he was first being tested for COVID, was Hope Hicks, who is a political advisor who's very close to the Trump administration and President Trump himself. So yeah, you had the news that she had tested positive, Trump was isolating. Then you had the news that he actually had it, and there was a media furore. He's been to the hospital, he's been on oxygen, he's been on steroids, he's come back. That's sort of like a very condensed timeline. And obviously now he's had it, he should be isolating for 14 days, but he's still gone back to work in the Oval Office, which has led to reports of saying that, he really should be put on rest and put out the way, but instead, because he's working in the Oval Office and is still potentially contagious, people now have to go in, staffers in full PPE, if they want to work with the president. Trump's response to this has been maybe what you'd expect, quite bullish. He's come out and said, oh my goodness, like, I've survived COVID, I'm invincible now, nobody should be afraid of it, we've got the best treatments available, which has led to frustration on many people who feel that, no, you should really be treating COVID seriously. You were a lucky one if you got out with, the effects that you did. But still, there are many people who haven't got out of it, 200,000 Americans or whatever the figure is, so it's quite an odd message to be sending at this time. So that's a very potted view of Trump with COVID, which was like a massive thing for the past week. What it's meant for the debates going forward is that clearly you can't have a debate with somebody who has tested positive and should be isolating. You can't have him in the same room as everybody else. So there has been a call to move for virtual debates. The world is run on Zoom at the moment. We've all lived that with the time. Why can't you have a presidential debate in that same manner? It came out today that Trump has rejected that call, seemingly. I think one of his claims was, they can just cut me off whenever, and I don't want that. So, this isn't the format we agreed to. They're just doing this because Biden, he thinks that Biden will appear better on a Zoom call if he's been able to be fed information from people. It's very different to if you're up on that stage by yourself. It's a lonely experience. You need to think on your feet up there. If it's on a Zoom call, maybe he can have people feeding him papers under the desk, etc., etc. So those are the reasons Trump has given for rejecting it. Personally, I think it's a bad move for the president. He's behind in the polls, okay, and he knows that he's generally unpopular. That first debate, although we didn't touch on it, polling after that suggested Biden won by about 48% to 41%. Now, that might tell you a lot. That kind of reflects the general polling at the moment, or where people stand. Like 41% is Trump's base. They'll probably like what Trump did. 48% probably represents the current Democratic base, plus some others, moderates in the middle. So, you can't read too much into that, but I think it's fair to say Trump is definitely on the back foot in this election. And if he's seen to be running away from a debate and more scrutiny, I think that can only play badly for him. The only people who will agree with that decision is Republicans and his base, and you can't win an election if you're just appealing to 41% of people. You need to get some moderates on your side. And the fact that Trump is unable to do that, or unwilling to at the moment, I don't think bodes well for his potential re-election chances. Now, there is a long time, and I think even Joe Biden has come out and said, look, that guy changes his mind every minute. So it's very possible we will get a debate in the end. This is classic Trump tactics of bluster, try and get a little bit more out of the format, try and, negotiate it so he can interrupt Joe Biden whenever he wants on the Zoom call as well. I don't know, by raising his hand or randomly muting him for a laugh. Putting a distracting background on, something like that.
Trump with just Mar-a-Lago behind him. Yeah, I can see it now.
Yeah. So, the fact that he's had COVID obviously will not only affect the format of the debates, but I think will also frame the next conversation that they have on COVID-19 and the response. It does appear that Trump is far more bullish about this, and some people are saying it might just be the steroids that he's on at the moment, and once they wear off, he might crash pretty bad. But we'll see. There's always an October surprise, something that happens in the weeks running up to the election. I don't think anybody quite expected it to be the president gets COVID and might die.
Yeah, it was a bit of a shock. And especially there was the bit where obviously, it was the same when, it's the same when anyone gets it who's heart, like they were saying he's got it, and they were giving very little information. Obviously people were like, oh, it's really bad. And it did seem like maybe some of the treatment options were a bit weird, but he seems to be out the other side of it okay, which, again, isn't surprising when you have access to pretty much the best healthcare in the world because you're the president. So, it's not surprising that he survived. But yeah, it was a bit weird for a day or two there where, if that had happened, and there was all this talk about what happens if someone dies running for office and all of this kind of thing. And it got very dark there for a little while. So yeah, it was interesting. And as you say, an October surprise. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we get another. It's only the 8th of October, so we've got time for more weird things to happen. But yeah, we'll see how that pans out. So I think we will take a quick break here to give you an advert for another show on the network.
Hi. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you took the schoolyard conversation of which one of my favourite fictional characters would win in a fight? Well, wonder no more. Join me, Chris, and my co-host Matt every other Sunday for Mishmash Mayhem, and you can find out.
So we're going to move on to our quick polls update. Obviously, we've just been talking about the debates. How have they affected the polling? So our first poll we're going to look at is the presidential national poll. So the lead here with the poll tracker we follow at 538, it's gone up for Biden, and it is increasing to go up, and Trump's dropping down. It's now at plus 9.5%. I think if you see some of the stories that go out on the media, it will sound like that's quite small, because there was a particular poll that found a 16% win for Biden. But this is why we always say you can't take one poll on its own, really, because if you were going on based on that poll, you'd be like, well, Biden's definitely going to win it. But 9.5% it's not an insurmountable difference, but it definitely looks like Trump is trending downwards and Biden is trending upwards right now. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that goes to show that maybe this is a very odd very odd presidential election, because usually you have people there are a lot of floating voters who haven't made their mind up about either candidate. And I think that was very true in 2016 when you had what was perceived of a disliked candidate in Hillary Clinton and an unknown quantity in Donald Trump. 4 years onwards, I think people have made their mind up on Trump. And that's leading to a lot of people, the polls being relatively steady. So this lead of about 9 points for Biden, you can go back to about July and see that Biden was in roughly the same space there. And that Trump's base, although it kind of has gone up and maybe was narrowing, Trump peaking at around about 43%, 43.5%, it's never really got over that mark. So essentially, if I was the president, I would be worried about these polls. This suggests that there isn't much of a path back for him, or it's going to take something catastrophic on the Democrat side to happen if President Trump is going to stand a chance. Now, I say this with all the caveat of last time when we had an election, we were all sure that Trump was going to lose, and surely Hillary's going to win. Clinton, that these polls will sort themselves out. I think back in 2016, they were a lot closer and a lot more volatile. And you had things like Hillary's emails bringing up these big bombshells in October that maybe tipped things in favour of Trump at just the right time. I feel pollsters maybe will have learned from their mistakes in 2016 and how they led people to believe that Hillary was going to win when that wasn't the case. And I think it means that Biden's message going into the last few weeks of this campaign will be, ignore the polls, we haven't won this thing yet, get your head down and keep going, we need to finish this off. Because there was a feeling maybe back in 2016 that there was an air of complacency or inevitability about Hillary's presidency that took everybody by surprise. I don't feel you're going to have that same level of complacency in 2020. They can't afford it. I don't think the Democrats could afford to have another shock like they did in 2020. Can you imagine if you're nearly 10 points up in October, losing from there? Even if they win the popular vote again, but not the Electoral College, it would be seen as a massive failure of campaign management to throw that type of lead away. So, yeah. But then again, the result of 2016 still has me holding back, saying, if this was any other election, if this was me looking at a UK election, I might be confident in saying, yeah, no, like the person who is 10 points ahead has got this. Even now, I'm like holding back on saying that because you don't want to jinx it.
No, I think people are more cautious about polls, and it's reasonable given the last few years where people maybe were over reliant on the polls. And yeah, we know polls aren't perfect for a lot of reasons. One of the things that definitely happened the last time round was that supporters of Trump, it's similar. Like similarly, some people there were outspoken people on Brexit. But some people were like, oh, actually supporting this doesn't look good, but internally they do, so they might not answer a poll truthfully. The only truthful poll, as we always say, is the actual vote. So, yeah, I think there's still the possibility that there's, some hidden information there, but it is quite a big lead. So, I think most people are saying it's looking like it's going Biden's way based on this, but there's still a month to go. Anything could happen. The other thing I just want to touch on briefly is the election forecast, which we touched on before. Very good and interactive. And this currently has Biden winning 85 in 100 possible scenarios, which I think is stronger than it's been before, but not massively. I think it was maybe in the 80s before. You'd have to listen to our older episodes. I don't off the top of my head have a comparison. But yeah, I think that's just there to say it does look like they're going to win that. And also note that the US Senate, Democrats slightly favoured to win, and the US House, Democrats clearly favoured to win. So it looks like it could be a return to Democrat power, which you would generally expect when a Democratic president comes in. But it is harder for them to win the Senate nowadays. There are some good podcasts I can link people to that I think will be in the show notes as well, talking about how they did not vote stuffing, but like by focusing money on smaller elections in the US, the Republicans were able to take over a lot more local government. And then that in turn affects people voting on the bigger seats like the Senate. Not necessarily the presidential votes, but other votes. So it's very interesting talking about how political advertising is done and things like that. And what happens when a big national campaign comes in unannounced to a local level campaign and throws a spanner in the works. Yeah, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I think other than, I know John Oliver did a very good piece on the Senate and how Republicans have control of that, and how the Senate is yet another example of voter suppression in a way, or making, how minorities' votes are suppressed in odd ways, because the fact that California has the same number of senators as many Midwest states it means that a vote for a senator in California is worth far less than a Midwest one. More minorities tend to live in Democratic states and the more popular states than the Republican ones. And then you've got places like is it Puerto Rico, I think.
Puerto Rico is the place that's basically a state, except it's not. And they keep having elections on they keep having votes on whether they should be allowed in. But obviously, the actual allowing a state in is reliant on a vote in the Senate. And there's a whole push and pull between, America is supposed to be this big welcoming place that wants more people. Puerto Rico is already basically America, so why shouldn't they? But then the Republicans are like, well, we can't allow in another state because they'll vote Democrat, and that's not okay. And then the Democrats are like, well, we're not being very democratic, etc. And similar discussions are held about whether people in DC should be able to vote. But that's a bit more constitutional, because there's I can't remember the exact terminology, but there's a provision in the Constitution that says something along the lines of the capital should be separate in some way, or it might be an amendment, but basically the capital should not have voting rights. But there are a lot of people living around DC who aren't represented, and so it's the famous line is taxation without representation. I think there's definitely some upcoming battles, especially if the Democrats take control of both parts of Congress. It will be interesting to see what happens in the next few years on those kind of issues, because you could see them trying to push those forwards, because it would help them. But also, I think there is a good, strong Democratic argument for both of those. Cool. Well, as always, Rob, thank you for joining me. You can find us in all of the usual places, whether that be patreon.com/TTSS, where you can give us some shiny, shiny dollars so that we can keep talking about this stuff and pay for our web hosting. Shiny new microphones, they're so shiny. They allow me to talk like this. And stuff like that. You can go to our website at parliamentary.observer, where you can find all the show notes and you can comment on the episodes themselves directly. You can go to YouTube and find us there, and you can find us on Facebook, Reddit, all the various places, Twitter, Instagram. Yeah, come and chat with us, recommend us to your friends, all the usual things we ask you. Always great to hear from our listeners who enjoy the show, and especially anyone who's joining us on Amazon Music, because we saw a spike from people over there. I think I mentioned that last time as well, but yes. Hello, everyone. Without further ado, I don't think there's anything else left for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him.
Bye.
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 Bye.